What's up, and welcome to the Cover 2 Recap. I'm BruinSportsport.com publisher Edward Lewis. As always, this is Ryan Karchi, the UCLA beat writer for the OC Register. We're here today at Spalding Field, where UCLA just wrapped up its final day of spring practice before the big spring game on Saturday. Nothing really happened in practice today, Ryan. It was basically just a walkthrough for the spring game on Saturday, but we did get a press conference with Jim Mora. Jim gave us some of the particulars about the spring game Saturday. Said it's going to be full contact, all live except for special teams. It's going to be 12-minute running quarters. It's going to be Noel Mazzoni starting offense versus Jeff Ulbrich starting defense. Going to be some ones versus some twos. Should be a pretty good game. What are some of your takeaways from what we heard today about what we can expect on Saturday?
Well, I thought it was interesting because we asked Jim Mora, how much he could actually evaluate from a game like this. Does a game like this actually help him when it comes to, deciding between certain position battles? And he was pretty frank about the fact that, this is more just a show for fans. I mean, at this point, they really, we've been talking about it all spring. They don't really have that many position battles. Most of them are already decided. Any other ones probably won't be decided until fall. So there's not really one position to look at for either fans or coaches. So at this point, I think it's going to be more just a good time for fans to really evaluate maybe what they haven't seen during this spring. Brett Hundley's not going to get much play. He's probably going to, I wouldn't doubt that he would get maybe one series before handing it over to Ashanti Willard and Jerry Neuheisel to kind of be the quarterbacks to run the show. But I think that if you're looking for anything to watch, I think maybe watching Ashanti Willard, especially, we've talked about it before, he kind of hit a wall this spring. But maybe he said, when we talked to him today, that this is kind of a big opportunity for him to play in front of a crowd and to kind of show off what he's learned. So I think that'll be, kind of judging between him and Jerry might be the one thing you want to watch at the spring game on Saturday if you're there.
Now, with spring ball officially wrapping up today, we really wanted to get into some of our standouts of the month and who we thought really had a great spring and really deserved noting on the Cover 2 recap. We want to give a top 5, but before we did that, Ryan, give me some of the honorable mention guys that just barely missed our top 5 cut.
I was especially impressed with Owe Odigizua. I think he definitely deserves to be on top of that honorable mention list. Just had a great spring coming back from the hip surgeries that he had before. Looked as fresh as we've seen him in a long time. A few other guys, Nate Esse, from the new kind of hybrid fullback position, a little different than fullback has been imagined in this offense before. He looked great, very athletic, kind of had that future NFL body. Other guys, Kenny Clark, as expected, looked like a monster out there. Probably going to be one of the best nose tackles, maybe even in the nation already as a sophomore. Other guys, Miles Jack, his name probably doesn't even need to be mentioned, but, he was that good that he deserves, he warrants being listed on that list just because of, it really seems like he's far from his ceiling at this point. And last but not least, Craig Lee. We thought, he looked really explosive for most of the spring. Kind of toned it down a little bit in this last week, but definitely has a high ceiling, and we'll definitely see a little bit more of him in the fall.
Getting into our top 5 list, number 5, Tahan Goodman kicks off the top 5 Cover 2 recap. I thought he had a fantastic spring. There were times out here where it just looked like one of those kind of NFL, Ed Reed kind of free safeties. He tailed off a little bit in the second half of spring ball. They gave away his starting job to Priest Willis. And Demetrius Martin said that was more because they want to give equal and fair amounts of reps to guys all across the board, so that way when they make the depth chart, nobody can complain or whatever. But for 2 or 3 weeks, he was dominant, possibly the best defensive player on this team. Give me number 4.
At number 4, he didn't exactly play in these last few practices because he hyperextended his knee. But Caleb Benenoch, I was very impressed with. First, there was his body transformation. Completely looked like a different player, just switched over to left tackle, and that was a move I was a little weary of at first, but he completely proved me wrong, in these last few weeks. Like I said, he slowed down a little bit, but in terms of a team that was without its left tackle after Torian White was dismissed, he's really stepped into that role, and I think he's going to be probably one of the strong points of this offensive line in the fall.
Number 3, we had Thomas Duarte. A guy got hurt in the last week or so of spring. He sprained his ankle, left on crutches. Doesn't expect to be serious, but for the first 3 weeks, he was arguably the breakout player of the spring. The guy was just open all the time. Even when he wasn't open, he was still catching passes. I don't think we saw him drop a single pass in 14 practices, 12 practices, 10 practices, or whatever he did. He was great. He looks like he's going to be Brett Hundley's either number 1 target or number 2 target this season. Should be kind of maybe the breakout player in the Pac-12, if not even the nation. Give me number 2.
Number 2 is probably, in terms of guys who kind of came out of nowhere, who surprised us compared to the expectations, Mossy Johnson just had an absolutely fantastic spring. This was a guy we all expected to play a defensive back. I mean, we didn't even expect him to see him at the position that he was at. He had a knee brace on, which didn't look to affect him at all. I mean, he was just a guy who, he really went across the middle. He caught the hard passes that, you know, he really showed that heart, I think, that you want to see from a young freshman who maybe doesn't necessarily know the ropes, but has shown a willingness to kind of go that extra mile. His hands were better than expected. He ran pretty solid routes. I think at this point, you know, we expected him to not contribute maybe for a year or even 2. I would be shocked if he doesn't contribute in the fall. I mean, at this point, I think he's kind of, you know, carved out that niche as that number 2 Y behind Thomas Duarte. And they've shown that they like to use more than one Y. So I think at this point, Mossy Johnson has kind of proved more than anyone else that he definitely deserves playing time in the fall.
And our number 1 standout of the spring is Fabian Moreau. You know, it was a guy we didn't expect a whole lot from. I mean, going into the spring, he was obviously the starter. We knew he was probably maybe in the number 1 corner, but just how good he's been this spring. I mean, for Jim Moore to call him a future first-round NFL draft pick and a future All-American, and to not have it sound like hyperbole was pretty impressive praise. I think he's been arguably the best player on this defense, maybe even had the best spring in terms of performances. I mean, he had a couple of days where it was just 10 pass breakups and a couple picks and stuff like that. His last half of spring was great, so he gets our number 1 nod. That'll wrap up our coverage of UCLA spring ball. As always, you can follow Ryan's coverage of UCLA at Ryan_Karchi on Twitter and at OCRegister.com. You can follow me on Twitter at EdwardLewisBSR and at BruinSportsPort.com. Until the next time, thanks for tuning in to the Cover 2 Recap.